The Winter War began in a white silence. But that silence quickly turned into a scream. A mighty empire hurled a million-strong army against a small country. It seemed the victory would be an easy march. But the snow of Finland became a deadly trap. There, the myth of the Red Army's invincibility collapsed. There, for the first time, the whole world saw the weakness of Stalin's machine. And it was there that a plan was born, a plan that, a year and a half later, would lead to the catastrophe of June 22nd. The Winter War was the prologue to the most terrible tragedy of the 20th century. The Winter War, prologue to the Great Catastrophe. In December 1939, the snowy expanses of Finland concealed the bodies of 27,000 Soviet soldiers. The entire world was stunned. How could the powerful Soviet state, which had just divided Poland with Hitler himself, suffer such a fiasco when fighting tiny Finland? But this was not the most frightening news for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The true disaster lay ahead. This short war would turn into the greatest catastrophe in history, because in the government offices of Berlin, every defeat of the Red Army was studied with meticulous care, leading to far-reaching conclusions that would form the foundation of Operation Barbarossa. The Pact and the Handshake of Enemies. Berlin, Moscow. On August 23, 1939, at Wilhelmstrasse, in a Berlin mansion, gathered those who, by every law of ideology, should have hated each other to death. On one side, the Nazi representatives led by Joachim von Ribbentrop. On the other, the Soviet diplomats headed by Vyacheslav Molotov. These sworn enemies sat down at the table to carve up Europe as if it were a pie. As a result, a non-aggression pact was signed between Germany and the Soviet Union. Officially, it was presented as a treaty of friendship and peace. In reality, it became a license for aggression for both totalitarian regimes. The global community froze in horror, unable to believe what was happening. Communists and fascists, who only yesterday swore to annihilate one another, now exchanged handshakes and clinked glasses of champagne. Are you ready for the shocking truth? The Secret Protocol. Eastern Europe as a trophy. The true nightmare was hidden in the secret additional protocol. This document, drafted with the cold precision of butchers, divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The USSR was granted control over the Baltics, Eastern Poland, Bessarabia, and Finland. Hitler, in turn, received Western Poland and complete freedom of action against France. The fate of millions of people was sealed in just a few hours of negotiations. Lithuanians, Poles, Latvians, Finns, Estonians, all of them became nothing more than bargaining chips in the geopolitical game of two totalitarian dictatorships. For Joseph Stalin, the signing of this pact became the moment of his greatest triumph. For the first time since the revolution, the USSR had completely untied hands along its western borders. No longer did it need to tremble before the so-called capitalist encirclement. For the chief capitalist of Europe had now become its ally. September. Poland between the hammer and the anvil. On September 1st, the mechanism set in motion in Berlin began to operate with German punctuality. Hitler unleashed the full might of the Wehrmacht upon Poland. Tank wedges pierced the Polish defenses, while Stukas, with their soul-tearing scream, bombed the cities. The world held its breath. The Second World War had begun. On September 17th, the Red Army struck Poland from behind. Soviet troops crossed the border under the pretext of protecting the brotherly peoples. Ukrainians and Belarusians. Poland was caught between the anvil and the hammer. The meeting of Soviet and German tank crews near Brest became an ominous omen of a new era. In just 17 days, the ancient Polish state vanished forever from the political map of Europe. In the Kremlin, there was unprecedented euphoria. Propaganda proclaimed the reunification of Western Belarus and Western Ukraine with the motherland. In reality, it was a naked annexation, thinly veiled with lofty words. Success was more intoxicating than the strongest wine. Stalin now felt himself the great gatherer of Russian lands, a worthy heir of Ivan the Terrible. Every kilometer seized fed his imperial ambitions. Do you know why the rich always grow richer? Appetite, as they say, comes with eating. The Baltic states by the base template: request, deploy, absorb. Hardly had the Polish campaign ended when the Kremlin turned its gaze to the Baltics: Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. 3 tiny republics that had dared to declare independence after the revolutionary upheavals. The scheme of absorption worked like clockwork, with polished, flawless precision. First came the request to station Soviet military bases, naturally, for protection against the supposed German threat. Then followed the expansion of garrisons under the pretext of rising tensions, demanding more defenders. And finally, the last act, a staged popular uprising and a voluntary appeal to join the USSR. The mechanism worked without a single shot fired, without excess noise. The world barely had time to express outrage. Finland as a challenge: 32 kilometers to Leningrad. What if I told you that everything you believed was a lie? Only one problem remained. Finland, a stubborn, unyielding, defiant country that flatly refused to play by Stalin's rules. A state with a population smaller than that of Leningrad alone dared to say no to a great power. The issue was not merely prestige, but national security itself. From the Finnish border to Leningrad, only 32 kilometers in a straight line. That was less than an hour's march for a mechanized column, and only a few minutes' flight for a bomber. Leningrad was not just a huge city. It was the industrial heart of the nation, where 1/3 of all Soviet ships were built. It was the main base of the Baltic fleet, the symbol of revolution, the city that had given birth to the history of a new world. To lose it would have been a catastrophe for the entire northwestern defense. And the Finns could at any moment allow the Germans to use their airfields. Imagine it. German bombers taking off from Finnish runways and 5 minutes later, raining their deadly cargo upon the factories of Leningrad. For a military strategist, such a situation was utterly unacceptable. Negotiations in Moscow. The price of concession, a grave. On October 12th, the Finnish delegation arrived in Moscow. The talks were meant to settle the territorial dispute by peaceful means. At first glance, the Soviet demands seemed almost reasonable. To push the border on the Karelian Isthmus 70 kilometers back, to cede several islands in the Gulf of Finland, and to lease the Hanko Peninsula. In return, the USSR offered twice as much land in eastern Karelia, but swamps and forests of little value. With a charming smile, Vyacheslav Molotov explained to the Finns, "You give less than you receive. Where is the injustice here?" But the Finns clearly understood the true essence of this deal. The Karelian Isthmus was their fortified shield, the only protection of their capital. To surrender, it meant opening the road to Helsinki, while the Soviet base on Hanko would turn the Gulf of Finland into a Soviet lake. Marshal Karl Mannerheim, with icy resolve, told the Soviet ambassador, "You want us to dig our own grave with our own hands?" He did not forget the fate of the Baltic states. First came bases, then occupation, and finally deportations. Concede today, lose everything tomorrow. The negotiations dragged on. The Soviet Union pressed, threatened, promised. Stalin himself received the Finnish delegates, underscoring the importance of the matter. But they stood their ground to the last. "Our independence is not for sale," declared delegation head Juho Paasikivi without compromise. In the Kremlin, irritation grew. How dare this tiny state dictate conditions to a great power? For Stalin, it was a personal insult. Poland had yielded, the Baltics had bowed, but Finland remained defiant. On November 9th, the talks collapsed completely. The Finnish delegation left Moscow empty-handed. That very day, troops began to mass on the border. Tank columns moved north, artillery took firing positions, aviation relocated. Stalin was absolutely confident of a swift victory. What could a country of 4 million people oppose to a 200 million strong empire? One strike is enough, and the White Finns will run, was his calculation. He did not realize he was plunging into the most disgraceful war in the history of the Soviet Union, a fatal mistake that would foreshadow the catastrophe of June 22nd. It works 99% of the time. But before the storm broke, the Kremlin was drafting plans for an easy victory. Plans born of monstrous, all-consuming overconfidence. In the spacious halls of the General Staff, work boiled day and night. Officers bent over maps, drawing red arrows of advance and calculating the number of divisions. The plan for Operation Thunder looked flawless on paper. A strike along 4 axes would crush the Finnish army in 10 to 14 days. "By New Year's, we will celebrate in the Finnish capital," declared Kirill Meretskov, commander of the Leningrad military district. The generals nodded and smiled. Of course. Against whom were they marching? Against a handful of Finns armed with hunting rifles. The main blow was planned through the Karelian Isthmus by the 7th Army under Vsevolod Yakovlev. 240,000 elite soldiers, 1,500 tanks, and 1,500 guns were to carve a corridor straight to Helsinki. The Finnish capital, according to the plan, was to fall within a week at most. Supporting strikes were prepared in 3 other directions. The 8th Army of Ivan Khabarov advanced in northern Karelia toward Joensuu. The 9th Army of Vasily Chuikov pushed through Suomussalmi in central Finland to cut the country in 2. The 14th Army seized Pechenga and the nickel mines. Here is what no one will tell you about. Behind that showy confidence lurked a terrible, inconvenient truth. The Red Army of 1939 was an army without a head. The great purges of 37-38 had torn out its entire high command. The figures were staggering even by the standards of Stalinist terror. Of 5 marshals, 3 were shot. Of 15 commanders of the 1st and 2nd ranks, 13 were destroyed. Of 85 corps commanders, only 28 remained alive. The army had lost not simply experienced officers, it had lost its brain. In the places of the executed came young upstarts whose sole qualification was blind devotion to the party. They were panic-stricken at the thought of making independent decisions, awaiting orders only from above and avoiding any show of initiative. Creative thinking in that era could cost a man his life. In November, no one wanted to think about this. Intelligence reports painted an exclusively optimistic picture. The Finnish army numbered only 300,000 men. There was no serious air force, only a few dozen obsolete fighters. Tanks, practically none. Only light, pre-war models. A Red Army soldier will easily defeat the White Finns, the head of intelligence reported. The population will greet us as liberators from bourgeois oppression. These words were laid on Stalin's desk every morning. The General Staff had already prepared a puppet government. The Finnish communist Otto Kuusinen, long resident in Moscow exile, was to be installed as head of the so-called Finnish Democratic Republic. It was planned that, immediately upon the Red Army's entry, he would address the people with a call to overthrow the bourgeois regime. The entire scenario was mapped out to the smallest detail. First, a border provocation, a few shots, a few victims. Then, righteous anger and demands for satisfaction. After the expected refusal, the forced use of force. A classic piece of Stalinist diplomacy. Soldiers were told everything in the simplest terms. We go to liberate the oppressed Finnish proletariat from bourgeois rule. The enemy is weak, morally degraded. Resistance will be brief. The main task is to prevent the White Finns from fleeing to Sweden. I lost 50,000 rubles because of this mistake. The fatal error was the complete, absolute unreadiness for a winter campaign. The Red Army had prepared for a short summer war against a weak opponent. There was a shortage of warm winter clothing, no white camouflage smocks at all, and only a handful of ski units. The command relied on a simple logic. The real winter would not arrive within 2 weeks, and the Finns would surrender even sooner. Why waste precious resources on what the generals believed would be unnecessary? Exercises turned into showy spectacles. Everything followed a pre-written script. The enemy was always cowardly and weak. The offensive was always successful, losses minimal. Officers feared reporting real problems. Such reports could easily be interpreted as sabotage. Tank crews had not been trained to fight in forested, marshy terrain. Infantry were used to wide fronts and open spaces. The Air Force trained only to bomb stationary targets. Signal units operated only in ideal, greenhouse-like conditions. No one taught soldiers to fight partisan bands. No one prepared them for ambushes, mines, snipers. All tactics boiled down to a simple formula. More planes, more tanks, more shells, more victories. Psychological preparation was also gravely lacking. Red Army soldiers were told that the Finns were a backward people who would panic at the very first shots. National pride, patriotism, the willingness to die for one's homeland. All this was dismissed as bourgeois prejudices. A Finnish worker will never fight against his class brothers, the political officers assured them. The real enemy, they insisted, was only the bourgeoisie and its hirelings. This naive, primitive scheme was meant to explain why the great proletarian army was marching to war against a small neighboring state. Guess what happened next? By the end of November, everything was ready. 4 armies, nearly 1 million men, were concentrated on the border. Thousands of tanks, hundreds of aircraft, tens of thousands of guns. A war machine capable of crushing any opponent. It only needed a pretext, and it did not take long to appear. On November 26, 1939, at 15 hours and 45 minutes, a series of explosions thundered near the tiny Karelian village of Mainila, hidden among pine forests and swamps. 7 artillery shells landed on Soviet territory, roughly 100 meters from the Finnish border. The result of the provocation was modest. 4 Red Army soldiers killed, 9 wounded. By the standards of a great war, it was a trifle, an unfortunate incident. But for the Kremlin, it was a long-awaited gift of fate. The pretext for a war that had been in preparation for many months. 2 hours later, TASS broadcast the message across the world. Finnish troops treacherously shelled Soviet territory, killing and wounding our border guards. Molotov summoned the Finnish ambassador and, with icy composure, declared, "Such provocations will not go unanswered." The Finns were in complete bewilderment and shock. They knew perfectly well that their artillery had not fired that day. Moreover, the nearest Finnish guns were located tens of kilometers from Mainila. A bombardment from the Finnish side was physically impossible, yet Moscow had no interest in such details. Do you know what your future looks like? The Finnish government proposed forming a joint commission to investigate the incident. They were willing to withdraw forces on both sides by 25 kilometers from the border to eliminate any chance of accidental clashes. Helsinki was prepared to take any reasonable steps to ease the tension, but Molotov brushed aside all proposals with a single motion. The decision had already been made in the highest chambers of the Kremlin. The Mainila incident was merely the final drop, a formal pretext. Negotiations were over forever. Diplomacy had run its course. On November 28th, the USSR denounced the Non-Aggression Pact with Finland, signed in 1932. The document that was supposed to guarantee peace between neighbors was declared void. Finland has violated all obligations, and the Soviet Union is no longer bound by any treaties, the official statement proclaimed. On November 29th, diplomatic relations were severed completely. The Soviet ambassador left Helsinki, the Finnish representative left Moscow. The Iron Curtain fell at last. From that moment, the only language available to the two states could be guns and machine guns. The world understood. This was a classic, theatrical preparation for aggression. No one seriously believed the Manila provocation. It had come too conveniently at the very moment talks had reached an impasse. Moscow's official reaction had been suspiciously swift. Finland declared a general mobilization on a scale unseen in peacetime. This changed the rules of the game forever. Of a population of 3,700,000, 337,000 took up arms. 1 Finn in 10, including elderly men and adolescents, prepared to defend their native soil against the invader. Factories shifted to wartime production. Women replaced the men gone to the front at the machines and lathes. Children dug trenches in schoolyards and outfitted bomb shelters in basements. The whole country became a single military camp, ready for siege. Marshal Mannerheim understood perfectly the utter hopelessness of the situation. There was absolutely no chance of winning a pitched battle against the Red Army. Soviet superiority in artillery, aircraft, tanks, and manpower was overwhelming. But surrender without a fight was impossible. That would mean the immediate end of independence. The only hope lay in dogged defense. To exhaust the enemy in brutal winter fighting, to hold out until spring, and to await promised military aid from the Western powers. Britain and France had already declared support for Finland. Perhaps their words would be followed by deeds. On November 30th, at 8 o'clock in the morning, Soviet troops crossed the border without an official declaration of war. The invasion began according to the pattern already rehearsed in Poland. First the blow, then the explanations. 4 armies advanced simultaneously along the entire front, from the Gulf of Finland to the Arctic Ocean. At 8:45, the Soviet Air Force delivered the first bombing strikes on Helsinki. Bombs fell on residential districts, schools, hospitals. The first victims of this war were civilians. 60 people were killed, including women and children. Thus began the Red Army's liberation mission. The main strike was delivered by the 7th Army under Vsevolod Yakovlev. 240,000 soldiers, 1,500 tanks, and 1,100 guns were to break the defenses on the Karelian Isthmus and seize Helsinki. According to the General Staff's plan, this march was to take no more than a week. Guess how long it took to achieve that? The 8th Army of Ivan Khabarov advanced in northern Karelia toward Joensuu. The 9th Army of Vasily Chuikov moved through Suomussalmi into central Finland to cut the country in two. The 14th Army of Valerian Frolov seized Petsamo and the nickel mines in the far north. On the first day, everything went strictly according to plan. Soviet forces easily crossed the river Sestra, took the border districts of Terijoki and Kuokkala. Fort Eno fell after a brief fight. In the north, the 14th Army, supported by ships of the Northern Fleet, captured Petsamo with virtually no resistance. Moscow rejoiced. Reports from the front fully confirmed the most optimistic forecasts. "The White Finn Army is scattering," the commanders reported. "Resistance is purely symbolic. We will reach Stockholm soon." But by evening on the first day, the first troubling signals began to arrive. The advance slowed on all axes. The Finns did not flee in panic. They withdrew in an orderly fashion, mining roads and blowing bridges, staging sudden ambushes. Every kilometer had to be taken in battle. World public opinion finally turned against the USSR. What had been planned as a demonstration of strength was rapidly becoming a demonstration of weakness. The Western press wrote of Soviet aggression against a small, peaceable country. On December 1st, in occupied Terijoki, a puppet government of the Finnish Democratic Republic was proclaimed under Otto Kuusinen. The USSR immediately recognized this regime and concluded a treaty of friendship and mutual assistance with it. According to that document, the legitimate government of Finland requested military aid against the so-called White Guard rebellion. But the Finnish people did not support the liberators. No one greeted Soviet tanks with flowers and bread and salt. Instead of joyful crowds, the streets held only emptiness and a hostile, silent condemnation. The Kuusinen government existed only on paper, with no real support whatsoever. By the end of the first week, it became absolutely clear. There would be no easy walk. This is why everyone does it wrong. The advance slowed to just a few kilometers per day. Red Army losses grew with each passing day. The Finns resisted far more stubbornly than the General Staff had expected. On December 14th came an event the Kremlin had not foreseen. The League of Nations expelled the USSR for aggression against Finland. The vote was overwhelming. 7 nations for expulsion, 1 against, 3 abstained. For the first time in history, a great power was cast out of an international organization. For the Soviet Union, it was a painful blow to prestige. The state that claimed to lead progressive humanity now found itself an international pariah. Finland, meanwhile, became a living symbol of heroic resistance to tyranny. But the harshest trials still lay ahead for the Red Army, because on the path of Soviet columns stood a true fortress, whose strength Moscow had not imagined. By mid-December, the euphoria of the first days was dissolving like morning mist. Reports from the front more and more often contained phrases about stubborn enemy resistance and temporary difficulties. What had been planned as a triumphant march was turning into hard, bloody work. The 7th Army, the main strike force, became bogged down on the approaches to the main Finnish fortifications. After 2 weeks of fighting, the advance amounted to just 40 kilometers. According to pre-war plans, by this time Soviet tanks were supposed to be entering Helsinki to the sound of brass bands. The problems began immediately after crossing the border. This is why you always get tired. The roads proved to be narrow forest tracks, completely unsuited for mechanized columns. Trucks stuck in the snow, tanks sank in swamps, artillery lagged tens of kilometers behind the infantry. The Finns skillfully used the terrain. They did not try to hold a continuous front, they simply lacked the numbers. Instead, they controlled crossroads, bridges, key roads. Every hill became a fortress, every grove an ambush. Units advancing in northern Karelia suffered the most. The forests were thicker, the roads worse, the enemy even more confident. The 8th and 9th Armies stretched out in long columns, lost all contact between their units, and became easy prey for Finnish raiders. Commanders reported to Moscow with extreme caution, careful not to upset their superiors. "The enemy offers unexpectedly stubborn resistance," they wrote. "But these are merely death throes. Soon, he will break completely." In reality, it was Soviet units that were breaking. The 164th Rifle Division lost 4,500 men, a quarter of its strength, in just 3 days of assaults on one fortified sector. Tank battalions suffered losses not only from enemy fire, but from mechanical failures in the savage frost. The greatest problem, however, was unpreparedness for winter conditions. The plans had assumed a quick autumn campaign, but December brought brutal ordeals for troops unequipped for cold. In that month alone, hospitals received 61,000 frostbitten soldiers. Many lost fingers and toes, crippled for life. Cold killed no less than enemy bullets. Soldiers froze in trenches, fell asleep in the snow, and never woke again. Can you guess what this is? The Finns, meanwhile, were perfectly equipped for winter war. White camouflage suits made them invisible on the snow. Warm boots allowed them to stand for hours in the frost. Skis gave them swift movement across the snowy terrain. They moved like phantoms, appearing from nowhere and vanishing back into the white void. Red Army equipment failed en masse. Tank engines refused to start in the cold. Lubricants thickened into paste. Metal parts cracked under sudden temperature changes. More vehicles failed from mechanical breakdowns than were destroyed by the Finns. PPD submachine guns jammed at critical moments. Maxim machine guns froze after the first bursts. Artillery breaches locked up. Soldiers fought with the rifles of 1891, the only weapon that worked in any weather. The Army supply system turned into a real nightmare. Snow buried the roads, convoys stalled in massive drifts. Ammunition and fuel failed to reach the forward units. Soldiers went hungry, surviving on hardtack and canned food. Hot meals became a rare luxury. The morale of the troops dropped day by day. Red Army men could not understand why they were fighting the Finns. They were told they were liberating oppressed brothers. But in reality, they met only bullets and hatred. For many, it was the first time they wondered, are we doing the right thing? Finnish propaganda proved extremely effective. Leaflets in Russian were dropped over Soviet positions. "Russian soldier, why have you come to die on foreign soil? Your family waits for you at home. Surrender, and you will live." These appeals resonated with the exhausted troops. Commanders increasingly reported cases of self-inflicted wounds and desertions. Political officers held meetings, explaining the purpose of the war. But words meant little against -40 degrees and Finnish bullets. In Helsinki, meanwhile, there was a real government under Risto Ryti. It mobilized every resource of the country to repel the aggressor. Women sewed warm clothing for soldiers. Children collected scrap metal for munitions. Old men dug trenches. Marshal Mannerheim rode along the positions, encouraged his fighters, and personally directed the defense of key sectors. His authority was immense. The soldiers would follow him through fire and water. "The enemy is strong, but we fight for our native land," the old marshal told them, "and that is worth more than any tanks." International support for Finland grew by the day. Sweden sent military supplies and volunteers. France and Britain prepared an expeditionary corps. The United States declared a moral embargo on supplies to the USSR. The whole civilized world stood with the small, heroic nation. By the end of December, it was clear the Blitzkrieg had completely failed. Instead of a quick victory, the USSR faced a drawn-out war in the most unfavorable conditions. Losses were already in the tens of thousands, Yet the front line had barely shifted. The Kremlin grew increasingly nervous. Stalin demanded immediate explanations from his generals. How could a handful of Finns hold back a million-strong army? Where was the promised breakthrough? The generals shuffled and promised to intensify the offensive. The international uproar only grew louder. The Western press relished Soviet failures, calling the Mannerheim line an insurmountable barrier to Stalin's aggression. The prestige of the USSR collapsed day by day as the war dragged on. By January 1940, it was obvious. The defensive line could not be taken head-on. New tactics were required, with more heavy equipment and more troops. But time was working against the Soviets. Each day of war turned the little victorious campaign into a major international scandal. Yet the Mannerheim line was not the Red Army's only enemy. The Finns had a new ally, harsher than any fortifications, the northern winter itself. January 1940 brought the Red Army an adversary more merciless than Finnish machine guns. The cold struck with unprecedented force. Temperatures dropped to -43 degrees. In such conditions, every hour in the open became a fight for survival. Soviet soldiers faced the brutal frost in summer uniforms. Thin greatcoats, cotton blouses, boots without felt liners. All this sufficed for parades, but not for war in the far north. White camouflage suits were in catastrophic shortage. In January alone, Army hospitals admitted 61,000 frostbite cases of varying severity. Many men lost fingers and toes, crippled for life. Deaths from cold rivaled those from enemy bullets. Soviet equipment failed en masse without Finnish help. Tank engines refused to start in the extreme cold. Lubricants thickened into tar. Metal parts cracked from sudden temperature shifts. PPD submachine guns jammed at the worst moments. Bolts froze, cartridges stuck in magazines. Maxim machine guns froze after their first bursts, reduced to useless scrap. Even the dependable Mosin rifles faltered. Artillery pieces became unmanageable. Aiming mechanisms froze solid with ice. Shells failed to explode because the explosives had hardened. Howitzers fired blindly, causing no harm to the enemy, but revealing their own positions. The Finns, however, were impeccably prepared for winter war. White camouflage suits made them virtually invisible on snow-covered terrain. Warm, layered clothing allowed them to remain in the freezing cold for hours without harm. Skis gave Finnish soldiers unmatched mobility in deep snow. While Soviet infantry waded knee-deep in drifts, the Finns glided over the surface like phantoms. They appeared as if from nowhere, struck and vanished again into the white void. Thermoses of hot coffee sustained their morale. They had warm meals, dry changes of underwear, waterproof boots. Every detail of their gear was designed with the harsh conditions of the Northern War in mind. Sniper Simo Heiha, nicknamed the White Death, became the symbol of Finnish sharpshooting mastery. This was the most costly mistake of my life. A short farmer from Karelia, he killed up to 5 Soviet soldiers a day with an ordinary rifle without a scope. In 100 days of war, he racked up 500 confirmed kills. Soviet soldiers feared to lift their heads from trenches and dugouts. Death could come from anywhere. From a snowy forest, from the top of a pine tree, from behind an innocent-looking drift. Finnish snipers worked methodically, targeting communications men and officers first. Lighting fires was strictly forbidden. They betrayed positions to the enemy. Soldiers warmed themselves with their breath, pressed together in cramped dugouts. Many fell asleep in the snow and never woke again. Frostbitten limbs turned black and rotted away. Supplying the troops became an almost impossible task. Roads were buried in meter-deep drifts, supply convoys with food and ammunition stalled, stretching for dozens of kilometers. Only a fraction of the supplies ever reached the front lines. Hot meals were the rarest luxury. Red Army soldiers ate frozen bread they had to chop with axes. Canned food became solid ice. Tea was brewed from snow and drunk lukewarm. Medical help was nearly unavailable. Wounded men had to be dragged on skis through snowy forests to hospitals. Many died of exposure before they got there. Surgeons could not keep up with amputating frostbitten limbs. The morale of the troops collapsed catastrophically. The soldiers could not understand why they were dying in these cursed forests. Desertion became widespread. Cases of self-inflicted wounds multiplied many times over. Political officers vainly tried to raise morale with speeches about international duty and liberating the workers. But hungry, frozen, demoralized men listened with open resentment. Words did little against 40 degrees of frost. Unit commanders reported the critical situation to higher headquarters, but their reports drowned in bureaucracy. In Moscow, they preferred to ignore the scale of the catastrophe, demanding more attacks, more offensives. By the end of January, it was obvious. The northern winter was fighting on Finland's side. Each day of frost inflicted more losses on the Red Army than all Finnish bullets combined. Winter turned Soviet soldiers into easy prey. But the Finns did not confine themselves to passive defense. They developed tactics unthinkable to the Soviets, even in their worst nightmares. While the Red Army froze in trenches and battered itself against the Mannerheim line, the Finns invented a method that turned the war into a nightmare for the invaders. They abandoned classical frontal battles and switched to guerrilla methods, exploiting their mastery of the terrain and natural conditions. The foundation of the new tactics was the Matti system, a Finnish word meaning a pile of firewood. Soviet divisions, stretched out in long columns along narrow forest roads, were chopped into separate pieces like logs split by an axe. Each piece was then methodically destroyed. Light ski detachments of 15 to 30 men moved through snowy forests with the speed of wind, while Soviet infantry floundered in deep snow. The Finns slid over the surface, outflanked entire columns, and struck where least expected. The main weapon of the raiders was the Molotov cocktail, bottles of incendiary mixture. Here is what happens in the first 24 hours. This simplest of weapons proved deadly against Soviet tanks. One well-thrown bottle turned a T-26 into a blazing steel coffin. The name Molotov cocktail was born as a mocking reply to Soviet propaganda. When Molotov claimed the USSR was dropping food baskets for the starving Finns instead of bombs, the Finns answered, "If these are food baskets, then our cocktails are the drinks for dinner." Psychological warfare became an inseparable part of Finnish tactics. At night, from the snowy forests, came wild screams, moans, the sound of horns and drums. Soviet soldiers could not sleep, jerking at every rustle, firing at shadows and their own imagination. Cuckoo snipers turned movement at the front into Russian roulette. They hid in trees, in snow shelters, in the ruins of burned houses. One shot, and another Red Army man or officer fell dead. The fear of death from ambush, the panic, shattered the soldiers' minds. On December 18th, a telling episode took place. A Finnish ski detachment of just 200 men attacked the 75th Rifle Division, which numbered 15,000 soldiers. In a single night, the Finns killed 1,000 Red Army troops, captured artillery, and vanished completely into the forests. Guerrilla raids into Soviet rear areas became systematic. Finnish saboteurs cut telephone lines, depriving units of contact with command. They blew up food and ammunition depots, set fire to fuel convoys, mined roads. The Red Army lost control of its troops. Orders never reached their executors. Reports from the front were delayed by hours, even days. Commanders acted blindly, knowing neither their own forces' positions nor the enemy's. Most painful were the night raids on Soviet camps. They crept up silently on sentries, killed them with Finnish knives, slipped inside the perimeter, set fire to stores, slashed the tents of sleeping soldiers, spreading chaos and panic. Soviet troops no longer felt safe, even deep in the rear. The enemy could appear anywhere, at any moment. It frayed nerves, stole sleep, turned each night into a test of survival. Finnish propagandists amplified the psychological pressure. Leaflets in Russian rained down on Soviet positions. "Your wife and children are waiting at home. Surrender, and you will live." For the first time, many Red Army soldiers began to question the purpose of the war. They had been told they were bringing liberation to the oppressed Finnish proletariat. But in reality, they found only the desire to kill and endless hatred. Where were the peasants and workers who were supposed to greet Soviet tanks with flowers? Desertion became widespread. Soldiers in groups threw down their weapons and fled into the forests, trying to reach the border. Many froze to death in the snow, fell prey to Finnish patrols or wild beasts. But to them, it seemed better than certain death in senseless attacks. Command tried to fight the collapse of discipline with brutal measures. Deserters were shot on the spot. The families of traitors to the motherland faced repression. Blocking detachments were ordered to fire on retreating troops without warning. But terror did not work against Finnish tactics. The more Red Army soldiers died in the forests, the stronger grew the fear of the invisible enemy. The Red Army sank slowly but inexorably into demoralization and chaos. I never thought I would say this. But the most terrible lesson of Finnish tactics awaited the Red Army in the snowy forests near the lost town of Suomussalmi. Here, 2 entire Soviet divisions were about to disappear. In early December 1939, the 163rd Rifle Division received orders to capture the small Finnish town of Suomussalmi. On paper, the task could not have been simpler. 17,000 Soviet soldiers against a handful of Finnish reservists. Command promised the men, "You will celebrate the new year in warm Finnish houses." The division advanced along the only forest road in a long column. Supply trains, artillery, tanks stretched for 30 kilometers through the snowy taiga. Communication between units was maintained only by radio, which was often disrupted by frost and atmospheric interference. The Finns watched the Soviet column carefully. They had a plan worked out to the last detail. Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo, in command of the defense of Suomussalmi, knew every path in the surrounding forests. He decided to apply the Modi tactic on the largest scale yet. On December 9th, the 163rd Division entered Suomussalmi almost without a fight. The Finns abandoned the town, retreating into the forests. Soviet commanders rejoiced. "The mission is accomplished ahead of schedule." Victorious reports about the destruction of white Finn bands flew to Moscow. But it was a trap. The Finns had lured the division into a sack with only one way out, the very road by which they had come. And that road the Finnish ski troops had already cut in several places, dividing the 17,000-strong division into isolated groups. On December 27th, the 44th Motorized Division under Brigade Commander Alexei Vinogradov marched to the aid of the encircled troops. It was considered one of the Red Army's finest formations, a mechanized division with modern artillery and tanks. But the 44th fell into the same trap. The Finns allowed its columns to advance along the road, then cut the lines of retreat and supply. Now, in the forests of Suomussalmi, 2 Soviet divisions with a total strength of 45,000 men were trapped. Against them stood only 11,000 Finns under Colonel Siilasvuo. The ratio of forces was 4-1 in favor of the USSR. But the Finns knew and controlled the terrain, had short supply lines, and were familiar with every meter of the forest. The siege began, lasting nearly a month. The Soviet units were broken into separate pockets surrounded by snowy woods. The Finns harassed them methodically with machine guns and mortars, giving them no rest day or night. Temperatures dropped to -42 degrees. Soviet soldiers froze in shallow trenches dug into frozen ground. Firewood for campfires quickly ran out. The wounded could not be evacuated. All the roads were in enemy hands. Supplies to the encircled groups ceased completely. The men starved, living on emergency rations of canned food and hardtack. Ammunition dwindled day by day. Fuel for trucks and tanks was gone within the first week. Attempts to break out ended in disaster. Finnish ski troops emerged from the forests, raked Soviet columns with anti-tank guns and automatics, then vanished into the white emptiness. Every meter of road cost dozens of lives. Vinogradov tried several times to coordinate the two divisions by radio, but communication failed constantly. The Finns jammed transmissions or even broadcast false orders in Russian, sowing chaos in command. By early January 1940, the Soviet units began to disintegrate. Discipline collapsed. Soldiers deserted in groups, throwing down their weapons. Many surrendered to the Finns, preferring captivity to agonizing death from cold and hunger. On January 5th, the Finns launched a decisive assault. They attacked the encircled groups from several directions at once, with mortars and artillery. Soviet resistance crumbled in a matter of hours. The rout was shameful and complete. Of 45,000 men in the two divisions, only 500 surrendered. The rest perished from hunger, cold, and Finnish bullets. The battlefield was littered with frozen corpses in budyonovkas and greatcoats. The trophies astounded: 43 tanks, 270 guns, 1,600 horses, hundreds of machine guns, thousands of rifles. All of it fell to the enemy with hardly a fight. An entire army had simply dissolved into the snow. The world press called Suomussalmi the greatest military disaster of the 20th century. How 11,000 Finns annihilated 45,000 Soviets. Western military experts studied Finnish tactics closely, drawing conclusions about the critical weaknesses of the Red Army. In Moscow, the news of the catastrophe was met with deadly silence. Stalin summoned the leadership of the People's Commissariat of Defense and delivered a furious dressing down. Someone had to be blamed. Brigade Commander Vinogradov was arrested and shot as an enemy of the people. But the real problem lay not in individual officers, but in the system itself. The Red Army revealed its complete unpreparedness for war in difficult conditions against an intelligent, determined foe. Suomussalmi became the symbol of that unpreparedness. By February 1940, the Kremlin understood. The war was turning catastrophic. Command and tactics had to be changed drastically, or the shame would be indelible, and the whole world would see the weakness of a great power. After the disaster at Suomussalmi and the failure to storm the Mannerheim line, the Kremlin finally realized. The little victorious war had become a huge problem. The prestige of the USSR was plunging. The international situation grew critical, losses already numbered in the hundreds of thousands. On January 7, 1940, Stalin made a decisive move. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko replaced the disgraced Meretskov as commander of the Northwestern Front. A tough, experienced leader, capable of imposing order with an iron hand. Timoshenko received carte blanche from Stalin. Any resources, any number of tanks, any troops. The priority was to turn the war around and save the face of the Soviet Union. Defeat at the hands of Finland was politically unacceptable. On the Karelian Isthmus, colossal forces began to concentrate. By February, 1,300,000 men, 3,000 tanks, 3,000 aircraft were gathered, more than Germany had when it invaded Poland. The narrow sector of the front turned into a giant military camp. Timoshenko radically changed tactics. Instead of frontal attacks along the entire line, he decided to concentrate all firepower on a narrow sector near Summa. Here, the decisive breakthrough of the Mannerheim line would take place. The artillery preparation reached unprecedented scale. On a single kilometer of front, up to 100 guns were concentrated, a density unknown even in the First World War. Each day up to 300,000 shells were fired at Finnish positions. The earth shook under the continuous bombardment. The forest became a lunar landscape of craters. Concrete bunkers cracked under direct hits from heavy shells. For the first time in the entire war, the Mannerheim line began to split apart. Parallel to this, storm engineer groups were being prepared, armed with special wire cutters, explosives, and flamethrowers. Their task was to get right up to the bunkers and destroy them from within. Losses did not matter. Sappers, under enemy fire, blew up anti-tank obstacles, built crossings over ditches, cleared paths through minefields. Many were killed, but every bunker destroyed brought the breakthrough closer. The Air Force worked around the clock. Bombers dropped tons of explosives on Finnish positions. Ground attack aircraft strafed anything that moved in the enemy rear. Fighters gained air superiority, shooting down the few Finnish planes. For the first time in the war, heavy KV-1 tanks were used on a large scale. Machines practically invulnerable to Finnish anti-tank guns. These steel monsters cleared the way for infantry, crushing strongpoints under their tracks and blasting bunkers at point-blank range. Finland, meanwhile, was stretched to its limits. 3 months of continuous fighting had drained the material and human resources of the small country. Ammunition stocks were enough for only 2 or 3 more weeks of heavy battles. Mobilization reserves were completely exhausted. Western aid never truly arrived. Britain and France limited themselves to words of support and deliveries of obsolete weapons. The promised expeditionary corps stalled in negotiations with Norway and Sweden over troop transit. Marshal Mannerheim understood. If the USSR applied its new tactics consistently and skillfully, the defensive line would not hold. The enemy's superiority in strength and equipment was simply too great. The Finnish army could hold for another month or 2, but no longer. On February 11th, at 8 in the morning, the decisive offensive began. The artillery preparation lasted 2.5 hours. In that time, 150,000 shells of all calibers were fired at Finnish positions, more than in the entire war up to that point. Then the storm groups attacked, supported by heavy tanks. The 123rd Rifle Division was the first to break into enemy trenches near Summa. Fierce fighting raged for every meter of trench, for every bunker. The Finns resisted desperately, knowing it was their last line. But the imbalance of strength was overwhelming. Gradually, the Soviet units pressed deeper into the defenses, widening the breach. On February 17th, the key strongpoint at Summa fell. The road into the interior of Finland was open. The Mannerheim line, thought to be impregnable, at last had cracked. But victory came at a monstrous price. The 123rd Division lost 60% of its men in just 4 days of fighting. The battlefield was littered with corpses in helmets and greatcoats. Every kilometer of advance was paid for with thousands of lives. By the end of February, it was clear. The breakthrough had succeeded, but the Finns were not yet broken. The final, decisive battle for the ancient city of Vyborg still lay ahead. On February 28th, Soviet tanks rolled into Vyborg, the old fortress, the key to central Finland. The city burned in dozens of places. The streets were blocked with the rubble of destroyed houses. But resistance continued in every quarter. The Finns turned every house into a fortress, every street into a battlefield, making Vyborg a fiery hell for the attackers. Soviet units advanced meter by meter, house by house. Tanks blasted buildings at point-blank range. Artillery shelled the city center day and night. But Finnish soldiers, holed up in attics and basements, fought on. Snipers fired from ruins. Machine gunners dug into the wreckage of banks and shops. Vyborg's central square became a lunar wasteland. The town hall gaped with holes from tank shells. Breaches in the walls of houses revealed fragments of everyday life. Broken tile stoves, dishes buried in snow on kitchen tables, crooked paintings. The fall of Vyborg would spell disaster for the Finnish defense. The road to Helsinki lay wide open. The Finnish army now faced the threat of total destruction and encirclement. Mobilization reserves were completely gone. Ammunition was running out hour by hour. To continue resistance meant national suicide. But the most devastating blow for the Finns came when Soviet troops broke through across the frozen Gulf of Vyborg. The 28th Rifle Corps, under Brigade Commander Kurochkin, crossed the Gulf on ice with artillery and tanks. It was a complete surprise. Finnish pre-war plans had only considered a summer scenario of hostilities. By March 9th, Soviet vanguard units had cut the Vyborg-Hamina highway, severing the city's supply lines. Finnish counterattacks shattered against a wall of fire. Major Varki's 7th Separate Battalion lost 75 men in a single assault, when Soviet machine gunners held their fire until the Finns closed to 50 meters and then unleashed a murderous barrage. Marshal Mannerheim summoned the government commission and grimly reported, "Our army can hold for another 2 or 3 weeks, no more. If we want to preserve independence, we must begin peace negotiations." Every day of delay would cost thousands of Finland's best sons. In Helsinki, it was clear there was no alternative. Continuing the war threatened total occupation and the disappearance of Finnish statehood forever. Better to lose part of the land than the whole country. President Kyösti Kallio gave his consent to peace talks, fully aware of the bitterness of that decision. On March 6th, a Finnish delegation led by Risto Ryti arrived in Moscow. The negotiations unfolded in a tense atmosphere. At the table sat representatives of a nation that had nearly lost everything but preserved its honor, and of a state that had bought victory at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives and its international standing. Stalin was ready to compromise, but only on his own terms. He obtained what he had wanted from the beginning: access to the Baltic and the security of Leningrad. But the price was monstrous, even by the standards of a totalitarian regime. Continuing the war threatened to turn a small victory into a national catastrophe. On March 12, 1940, the peace treaty was signed in Moscow. Its terms were harsh for Finland, but not fatal. The USSR received the Karelian Isthmus, with the city of Vyborg, the northern shore of Lake Ladoga, parts of the Raibashi and Sredny peninsulas, and strategically important islands in the Gulf of Finland. The Hanko Peninsula was leased to the Soviet Union for 30 years as a naval base, turning the Gulf into a Soviet lake. In total, Finland lost 11% of its territory and 30% of its economic capacity. 422,000 citizens became refugees. But above all, Finland preserved its independence. It was a unique success, unmatched by any other country subjected to Stalin's aggression. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania vanished from the map, absorbed as Soviet republics. Finland endured, paying in blood for the right to remain free. 422,000 Finns voluntarily left the territories ceded to the USSR. They departed with suitcases and bundles, unwilling to live under Soviet rule. Columns of refugees trudging along snowy roads became the symbol of the price of independence. Bitter, but not fatal. On March 13th, the day after the treaty was signed, Soviet forces continued their assault on fully captured Vyborg. Lieutenant General Harold Öqvist, with full military ceremony, lowered the Finnish flag from the tower of St. Olaf in Vyborg Castle. It was the final battle of a war that had lasted 105 days and claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands. The losses of both sides were staggering in scale and imbalance. Finland lost 26,662 dead and 43,557 wounded. For a small country, it was a national tragedy, but not demographic ruin. The Soviet losses were many times greater and shocked even their own commanders. Officially, 126,875 were killed and 264,908 wounded. The real figures were worse still, up to 400,000 total casualties by some estimates. The ratio of losses was 5-1 in Finland's favor. It was an unprecedented case in 20th century military history. A small army not only resisted a giant, but inflicted catastrophic, unacceptable damage. Beyond human losses, the USSR lost 1,200 tanks, 600 aircraft, and 1,600 artillery pieces. More equipment was lost than the Wehrmacht had in its successful Polish campaign. The myth of the Red Army's invincibility and technical might was publicly and definitively shattered. The consequences of the Finnish tragedy proved fatal for the USSR. The Winter War revealed critical weaknesses of the Soviet war machine. Incompetent command after the purges, unpreparedness for modern warfare, inability to fight in severe climates, failure against a motivated enemy. But the most devastating were the political consequences. International isolation, expulsion from the League of Nations, the stigma of an aggressor. All of this echoed back just 1 year later, when allies were desperately needed against the Nazi threat. This will change the way you see the world. The world witnessed the true weakness of Stalin's military machine. In the offices of Berlin, every detail of the Finnish campaign was carefully studied. Hitler and his generals drew their conclusions. The Red Army was a colossus with feet of clay. Its command was incompetent after the purges. Its equipment was unreliable in harsh conditions. Its soldiers were demoralized. These observations became the foundation of Operation Barbarossa. The irony of history was cruel. Finland became an ally of Germany in the war against the USSR. In June 1941, Finnish troops returned to the lost territories as partners of the Wehrmacht. The blockade of Leningrad, the very city for whose security the entire war had been waged, became possible precisely thanks to Finnish support for the Germans. Stalin sought to secure Leningrad, yet created the conditions for the most terrible siege in history. He tried to demonstrate the power of his army, yet showed its weakness to his enemies. He planned a quick victory, yet ended up with a prolonged, bloody struggle that drained the Red Army on the eve of the real war. Thus, the small, victorious war turned into the greatest strategic disaster for the USSR. Stalin gained his territories, but paid for them with the defeat of June 22nd. The Winter War became the prelude to the tragedy of the Great Patriotic War, which almost destroyed the Soviet Union. The main lesson of the Finnish tragedy is clear. Empires fall because of their contempt for small nations and their own arrogance. 105 days of humiliation in the Finnish snow showed the world the true cost of Stalin's ambitions. And that cost was monstrous. The most terrible war in human history began with the careful study of Soviet weaknesses revealed in the struggle against unyielding, small Finland. The Finnish War was not merely a defeat. It was a sentence. One that would be carried out exactly 15 months later, at dawn on June 22, 1941. Are you ready for the shocking truth about what happens when a great power underestimates its enemy?